Hi, I'm Zev Weinstein and welcome back to my YouTube video channel. Today I'm sitting here with a special guest. You may know him from my Twitter feed because I introduced him in 2009 under the pseudonym 4YO, but he's now 13 years old and I wanted the world to meet my son, Zev Weinstein. Zev, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm not sure what we could best discuss, but one thing that's exciting to me is that I've understood that you're thinking about starting a YouTube channel. Can you tell me what's going into that thought process?
Well, I think one sort of problem with our generation, which I think is bound to be a very important generation, is that at the current age of most of our members, we're not particularly verbal or expressive, and I think that this is an issue. And if maybe some past generations could sort of get a better understanding of sort of the newcomers, I think that could be very, very helpful to the world. And I think there's a lot that needs to be discussed and talked about. And I hope to sort of have an outlet to share my thoughts and ideas with the world so that someone in our generation is being expressive of what we're going through.
So that's super interesting. Let's riff off of that for a second. I think what I feel is that I'm learning a tremendous amount from you because you're not shy about expressing not only your ideas, but conflicts between the ideas as you sort of assemble a perspective. Why do you suppose it is that there's so much interest in what people believe after the millennials?
Well, I think one thing which is becoming increasingly more and more obvious is that this is a very, very unique time period. And I think this is going to be a very, very unique generation. And I think, for the most part, the world is not stable at the moment, right? I think we're in sort of a poorly defined revolution, maybe sort of similar to the late 60s in a sense. Or, there are certain time periods where no one's quite sure what to make of the world. And I think that's definitely what we're experiencing at the moment.
Can I just ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So, as you know, these are your developmental years. And if I just take what you were saying about the late 60s, it's probably the case that if you were growing up and you were 13 in 1968, your brain was learning about a set of circumstances that really were very temporary and impermanent. Do you feel that in some ways this is a disadvantageous type to be growing up because so much appears to be highly unstable, or do you instead have a sense of being energized by the instability?
Well, I think sort of my more general take, right, is it's nearly impossible to predict any of this because, if you think, for example, about technology and how rapidly it's evolving, there's absolutely no way to predict it and to predict what the future is going to look like. And that's something which does seem to be sort of a definitional part of this generation and this time period. And I think as a result of that, it's very hard to predict sort of how the figures of our generation will turn out and how some of this stuff could benefit us or become a disadvantage. And I think there's just sort of a lack of understanding. On the one hand, we're growing up with access to a lot of stuff, and I think a lot of things are changing for the better. But I think the world is very, very divided, at least in America at the moment.
What are you seeing as being the major fault lines in that division?
Well, I think to a very large extent, the right has gotten a lot crazier and the left has gotten a lot crazier, and everyone's being forced to pick a side. So this is something which I'm pretty unhappy about, and I get the sense that you are too. And I don't think either side really knows what it's doing, and we're being forced to pick one. And I think that that's really dividing us at the moment. I think, for example, a lot of people are getting categorized and associated with alt-right as sort of a boogeyman, and you see sort of parallels of this where people will be associated with very far-left figures. And I think I have a lot more experience with one side of this, given that I've grown up in California and New York, which are maybe some of the two most democratic states in the United States. So I think, I only sort of have one set of experiences, but I think it's not hard to understand what it might be like on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, one of my concerns, of course, is that we've never had a situation like the Trump administration in so many different ways, and that if this is what you think of as one of your earliest conscious political experiences, I do wonder what the kind of permanent effect is. I don't think that a lot of adults thought about what it would be like to have a world in which we don't even seem to agree whether the president was democratically elected because of the allegations of Russian vote tampering, whether people view various behaviors by the president as so unbecoming as to make him unfit for office, or whether other people see him as the only person capable of running the gauntlet and standing up for reasonable national interests that have been demonized as if they were jingoistic, out of control ultranationalism. So that's a very, I mean, even for me, that's pretty confusing. One of my questions would be, does your study of the past give you more perspective on this?
Well, I think to an extent, but it's very, very hard to try to compare and match our generation to anything previous. I think one example I gave was late '60s, which I think is similar, but a lot of the ways in which the world changed were sort of dissimilar. So I remember, when I was younger, I have a memory of mom telling me, I'm so happy you weren't growing up when some of the really nasty stuff was coming out about Bill Clinton. I have absolutely no idea, how I would have dealt with news and parenting a child, during that presidency, and I sort of accepted it. And then, a few years later, here we are, and it's, one thing, I think I'm old enough to sort of try to make sense of this as well as, anyone else, but it's very difficult. And I think one of the really positive things, which is eventually going to be seen more positively, even though it's causing maybe a lot of distress at the moment, is that with however crazy things are, at least people are talking about the issues, which were sort of hidden until recent years. And I think that will be an advantage for our generation, because there's nothing too taboo or far-fetched to be discussed. And I think we're going to get sort of a very complex understanding of the world, and a lot is going to be sort of uncovered for us. So I think that's sort of one of the gems that we've received growing up in this really, really confusing era.
So that at least things are under discussion.
Right.
Do you have any sense of whether you're turning to the past or to the present for the thinkers that mean the most to you? Who are some of the voices in the political sphere that matter the most to you?
Well, I think because I've grown up in a household with you, and you've been a very, very sort of strong presence in my understanding of the world, I don't think my views are exactly the same as yours. I know there are places we disagree, but I think you and your network have played sort of a very impactful role in how I view the world. And I think sort of the same for Mom. And I don't think anyone's politics in our family is exactly the same. So it's good, because I've gotten a sort of a spectrum even in my own home.
Well, I think that your mom, I mean, you're referring to Pia Milani at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, is one of the most sophisticated voices that really is connected to, I would say, the most responsible version of the analytic left from yesteryear. Mm-hmm. And I think that how do you see where I contribute differently?
Well, I think she's, as you sort of stated, a very traditional leftist, right? And I see you as sort of being a little bit more of a renegade, and you're trying to pick your own path, right? And I think my mother has played a lot of stability in some of my political views, but I think they're views which I'm sort of choosing not to hold many of them anymore, because I feel like some of the people that hold them now have gone so
well, this is
across the line.
this is this frustration that both you and I have, that you want to sign up for something that seems 80% reasonable, but that there's 20%.
I wouldn't call it 80-20 anymore.
What would you call it now?
I don't know. I think making up statistics is always hard. I can't give you numbers, but I really feel like the world has gotten a lot crazier than that. And I think, especially with a lot of the people I've grown up with as part of my generation and where I've grown up with, it's so far in one direction.
Yeah.
That it's very hard to try to have nuanced conversations with people, and I think that's been really difficult. On one hand, a lot of people are talking about a lot of things, but then within sort of a network and an environment, there's no room for discussion between the two teams, and I think that's been really hard because everything is so polar.
So this is really interesting. So in essence, rather than left versus right, you would prefer a nuanced group and a non-nuanced group, and you would feel, I assume that you see yourself as being more to the left than the right, or is that presumptuous?
Probably, and once again, I think a lot of these things are still very flexible in me, so I'm trying not to call myself either left or right, but I don't mind looking at it on a spectrum.
Well, look, I tried for a while not to use the spectrum, but the language just became almost a necessity, given that we have two parties and people get very confused.
Well, I don't think that's unintentional. I think in many ways the media is trying to starve us of a vocabulary which will really allow us to talk about these things in an attempt for different outlets to sort of preserve their own rhetoric. And I think it's not a mistake that there's no real language to discuss sort of a center of the spectrum.
So, what can we hope for in terms of some of the color that everybody's looking for on what might be termed Generation Z?
You mean my YouTube channel?
Or the generation that follows Gen Y that followed Gen X?
Yeah, so to clarify, I'm thinking of starting a YouTube channel titled Generation Z. One, because my name is Zev, and I thought that was really a hook, but also because that's probably one of the things I'll be discussing, which is Generation Z, as it's titled, which is what followed the Millennials.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'd like to try to get that out there. I don't mean to plug too much on your video show, but
subscribe now to Generation Z.
Appreciate you doing that, but I didn't have to.
Won't be the first time you've manipulated me effectively. Now, do you have any closing thoughts about what it is like to follow the Millennials and what you see the principal differences between Generation Z and the Millennials as being?
Well, I think it's very unclear still, but I think Millennials are holding increasingly more power over the world because they're sort of the closest to understanding our generation. So if you look at, the people that create various social media networks, I know, for example, I forget names, but I know the CEOs of Snapchat, for example, are like very young millennials. And I think that's because they sort of have an understanding of our generation. I think that's important.
You mean so they both have an understanding of the time, but also they are better able to market to that which is coming up, which is your group.
Right. And I still don't think that they have a perfect understanding, and hopefully I can try to shed some light. But
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I will say that I've learned a ton from you about this generation that everybody else is curious about, and so it will be very interesting. I would like to think for many people to have somebody trying to speak about your generation, but in ways that can be heard by generations that are a little older. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with, and let me know if I can help in any way.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, thanks for coming. Be well.